So now that we've gone over some various ways to set up particle simulations, let's take a look at setting up the sims for the mechanical bugs flying around the scene here. Now I've set up a geometry object called particles mechanical bugs, so let's dive inside there. And we'll start by object merging in the terrain just for a spatial reference. So let's point this object merge to object/environment/out terrain. And in order to build a region that we're going to have the bugs fly through, I'm going to create a tube based on this terrain here. So if you just create a tube object and pass the terrain into that, this will create a tube that fills up that entire space occupied by the terrain. Essentially, it's just a best fit tube around that input. Now we ultimately just want to use a tube to fill in the space above the terrain that the creatures will be flying through. So let's flip the tube around to just point away from the terrain here. And you could just position this manually if you want, but if you want to be procedural about it, you can just create a transform SOP. And I'm going to set the pivot of the transform to be the top center of the tube here. So in the pivot on this transform, let's set the pivot translate to the centroid of the input. So that'll be centroid of input number 0 and d_x for the x-axis. And I'll copy that. And then we're going to put that in the z-axis as well. Switch the dx to dz. And then for the Y pivot, I'm going to not use the centroid, but I'm going to use the max Y position of this. So we can use the bbox function and input 0, and then we'll say d_y max. So this will give us a pivot right around the top middle of this tube here. So then we can use a negative scale in the Y direction to flip this tube upwards. So you can just use this to define however high you want these mechanical bugs to potentially be flying. I think that works just fine. And I'm going to turn on the end caps for this tube. And then to scatter some points inside this tube for the initial bug positions, we can convert this to a volume. So you could maybe use a VDB from polygons, or you could use the slightly more old school ISO offset if you want to, and they do pretty similar things. I'm just going to increase the sampling divs on this to 100 for a better defined shape. And then we can do a scatter within this volume. So if you drop in the scatter SOP, by default this is going to create 1000 points in here, but I don't want very many of these bugs flying around. I honestly only want maybe 5 of those bugs to be flying around the scene, because there's enough other stuff happening that we don't want this to be just filled with these little flying bugs. Maybe I'll make my point display a little bit bigger so that you can see that a little bit better. And if you don't like this initial placement for whatever reason, maybe you want to reference this from your camera so that you can get a better initial distribution, you can just play around with this global seed until you get a scattering of bug positions that you like. So this looks like a reasonable initial distribution here. So let's create a DOPNet to simulate these particles swirling around. Then let's dive inside the DOPNet and we'll set up a pretty basic particle network for this one. We'll start with our pop solver, and we need a pop object for this to operate on. Connect object to the solver, solver to the output, and we'll also need a pop source. Connect that to the third input of the pop solver, and for the emission type, as I mentioned, the emission type I use the most often is the all points, just to bring in all of the points from our DOPNet input. And for that geometry source, I'll set this to the first context geometry rather than pointing to a SOP manually. And on the birth tab, I'm going to set the impulse activation to only happen at the start frame by using the variable st, which is the simulation time, is equal to 0. So in the previous video, I believe I used a check that said $f equals fstart, so that'll check to see if it's the first frame of the timeline, but this st equals 0 is actually a little bit better because simulation time being 0 is more reliable than just checking a given frame number, because you can actually set the DOPNet to start at any frame you want with the start frame here. So if you check the frame number against the start of your timeline, that might not actually be the first frame of your simulation. So st equals 0 is a little bit better and more reliable. So now we have these initial 5 particles being added to our simulation, and we can start adding some forces to drive the flight paths of these particles. And I'm going to use a pop axis force to get these particles kind of swirling around in a circle. So I'll drop that after my pop source. And you can set up a couple different shapes here. You can use a sphere or torus shape for this pop axis force, and we could position this manually with the center and radius and height and direction, just doing it by hand here. But just to keep things a little bit more convenient and procedural, I'm going to base this on the size of some of our initial setup bits here. So after the ISO offset, I'm going to drop in a null here called source volume. And then we can also use the pivot that we set up for this transform on the tube here. So I'm just going to copy this pivot translate. And then if you go back inside the DOPNet, we can paste a relative reference from that transform pivot into the center point of this axis force here. And just as a starting point, let's increase this radius quite a bit. I'll give it a radius of 100 and a height of 500. But actually, let's link these to that source volume null that we've created. So for the radius, I'm going to point this to the B box of ... /... which will go up to the DOPNet and then the particles mechanical bugs level of our hierarchy. And then inside there, we can find our source volume null. And then I'm going to use the d_xsize component to grab a radius for the sphere. But because this radius is actually about twice as large as we probably need it to be, we can shrink this down a bit. So I'm just going to try a radius multiplier here of 0.7, just so that we have a little bit of extra area around the sphere that goes a little bit beyond the terrain bounds. And then for the height, I'm just going to copy this B-box expression and paste that into the height there, except I'll change this to be the Y size. And instead of shrinking this down, which is giving us this very short little sphere here, I'm actually going to multiply that up a bit so that we get a nice and tall axis force. This default axis direction is fine, and we can now take a look at the speed tab, and we have a few different types of speed available. The orbit speed is going to be the speed around this y-axis here. The lift speed is going to be along the axis up and down here, and the suction speed will be toward the axis. So we don't really need the lift speed, at least I didn't choose to use it at all. I didn't really want to force the particle motion to go up or down the length of that axis. I just used some orbit speed. And if you add a bit of orbit speed and play this, you can see we have these particles going around in a circle around that axis there. But that orbit speed can actually kind of push them a bit out to the sides. So I wanted to add a little bit of suction speed as well, just to keep them from being kind of flung out wide. So I just added a little bit of suction speed, like 0.2, just to pull them inwards just a little bit. And this might be a little bit extreme here, but it's actually kind of hard to judge without seeing the terrain for reference. So let's stop the simulation and let's exit out of our DOPNet here. And let's display that DOPNet and display our terrain as well for reference. And always check things from the camera, because it's very common for things to look okay from one angle but not from your render camera, or vice versa. Now this initial particle motion looks pretty nice, but it is a bit too smooth and it's a bit too much of a perfect spiral, so we can make this look a lot nicer by breaking this up with some noise. So let's stop that and go back inside our DOPNet, and we can add some nice turbulent noise with the pop wind, so drop that after the pop axis force. And for the swirl size on this default of 1 is going to be very small at our current scene scale. If you go back to our terrain and middle mouse on that, this is 447 units wide. So if we go back to our pop wind, we'll have to use a much larger size for the swirl scale, because we don't want this to be super high frequency, tiny frenetic amount of motion. We're looking for some larger swirl shapes. So I'm going to try 100 with an amplitude of 50. And for the turbulence setting here, this is how many layers of detail there are in the noise, how many iterations of fractal noise or octaves, and 3 levels of detail isn't really necessary for the extra little bit of motion breakup that we're looking to add here. So I'm going to reduce this down to 1 so that we get less detailed turbulent breakup on this. And now after applying that pop wind, we have some much nicer and more interesting motion to these particles. There's a little bit of more organic randomness, and I think it works reasonably well for the motion of these so-called mechanical bugs. And you'll notice that there is perhaps a little bit more inconsistency in the speeds of these particles now. Some of them are moving faster than the others, which could be totally fine, but if you want to, you can certainly control some things like that as well. And before setting up the valid speed range for these particles, it can be really helpful to check what the current speeds you're getting out of the simulation are. So let's add an attribute wrangle and put that after the DOPNet, and I'll call this speed check. And this is something I do all the time, so I have a preset for this on my wrangle. So if you go to the gear icon here, I highly encourage you to save a preset for this as well. And I have one called speed from velocity that sets a speed attribute equal to the length of the velocity vector. So if we check our spreadsheet for this, you'll see that, well, on the first frame of the sim here, we're getting a speed of 0, and we have velocity of 0 as well, because nothing has started moving yet. But then, as we start moving through the scene here, you see we have some valid velocities and valid speeds, and at this frame it looks like it ranges from 32 to about 50. So if we want to control that a little bit more, we can go inside the DOPNet and add in a pop speed limit, put that after the wind, and we can turn on both minimum speed and maximum speed, or whatever you feel is most appropriate for your simulation. And for this, I'll try doing 20 and 30 to clamp down on those speeds a little bit more. And now checking our simulation after applying those speed limits, now we have this nice combination of our swirling motion with a little bit of turbulent noise breakup to make it more interesting and organic, and some speed limiting for more consistency between the different bug flight paths. And I think this is working pretty well. And ultimately, we may need to come back to this and tweak it once you see how it looks with the other elements in the scene, and how it looks once we put proper instances on these particles. But this is looking pretty good at this point, and we can go ahead and cache this out. However, before we cache it out, I pointed out that the first frame of this simulation has a velocity of 0, so I'm just going to do a 1 frame offset so that at the very beginning of our shot, these particles have some valid velocities. These velocities will be very important at the instancing stage, and it's also just good practice to make sure that you have valid motion blur at the start and end frame of your shot as well. So I've dropped in a time shift after the DOPNet, and I have a preset for my time shift to create a time offset here. So I will select that, give this an offset of 1. so that the first frame of our sim is actually returning frame 2 here. And then we can go ahead and cache this out to disk. And sometimes for simulations like this, especially when it's a very quick simulation and it doesn't take a lot of disk space, sometimes I'll simulate lots of extra frames. Like here I'm running 400 frames of this simulation so that we can easily just pick a different time range for the sim if we want to, or we could potentially do a time remap on it if we want, without actually rerunning the sim and recaching this out. So feel free to do this sort of thing anytime you feel like you might benefit from the flexibility of choosing different portions of the sim for your shot.